Hi, welcome to today's video. My name is Paul. So this week I'm going to take a look at a few watercolor paintings by Vincent Van Gogh. I guess we don't really associate him with watercolor painting. Most of the paintings that have survived were oil on canvas, but he did do a few watercolor paintings. We have about 150-ish watercolor paintings. Now, technically, strictly speaking, they're not pure watercolor paintings. Vincent was more of a mixed media type of guy, I think. So a lot of his watercolor paintings have a bit of pencil, a bit of pen and ink, some gouache. Basically, he mixed other things in with his watercolor paintings. But they are often referred to as Vincent's watercolor paintings, so that's how I'm going to refer to them. And I'm just going to go through and share some ideas of the things maybe we can learn from looking at art by other artists from the past. Some of the things that they maybe struggled with and how they tried to solve those problems and so on. And also just give my completely subjective personal ideas about some of his watercolor paintings. Okay, so the first one, I have to say, this was the one that you can see on screen at the moment, is probably my favorite Vincent watercolor landscape painting. It's not a very sophisticated painting maybe, but it works, I think. It captures the feeling of this place very well. So the grey sky, the green field with the, I don't know, cabbages or whatever it is that's growing. We don't see enough detail to recognize these things, but you get the idea that there's some sort of crop growing in these fields. It's a very flat landscape, but it does give a feeling of depth to the landscape. And he's using a bit of linear perspective here, in the sense that up close we can see blobs, green blobs and things and details quite large, but in the middle distance, in the background, they get smaller. So linear perspective. And there's also a bit of aerial perspective in there as well. Again, in the foreground you're getting more bright values and dark values contrasting, and as you go into the middle and the distance, you're losing those really dark values mainly. So in terms of learning things, if you're new to the idea of linear perspective, if you're new to the idea of aerial perspective and values, you can learn a lot by looking at paintings like these, and how to create a feeling of depth in your paintings, if that's what you want to do. The little wheelbarrow in the front, also on the right hand side, just adds something to the painting, I think. Sometimes I never really put things like that in my landscape paintings, but sometimes maybe I should occasionally put these things in. It adds a bit of a human touch, I think, to the landscape. Vincent did mention his watercolor paintings a few times in his letters to his brother Theo. Of course, a lot of those letters survived. And in this one, he mentions a couple of watercolors that he's happy with, but he doesn't feel that they're perfect, and he's still working on using watercolor. I think this is something that most of us can identify with. I think as artists, we're never completely happy with the paintings. There's always something maybe we can keep working on. There's also this idea, sometimes I've heard people say that, and I guess it's from people who don't really do any art or painting themselves, but this idea that if you're an artist, if you use, say, oil paint, why would it be so difficult to switch to using color or watercolor or a dry media or something like that? Of course, it is difficult, and just because you're good at one medium doesn't mean, or you're confident with one medium, it doesn't mean that you can just flip to a completely different medium and expect great results. So, let's say, Vincent was struggling with his watercolors, but he was hopeful that things were getting better, and he was gaining some confidence. These three, so I wanted just to mention a bit about painting skies in watercolor landscapes. There are different approaches to representing the sky. Some of them can be more representational, some of them can be more abstract. Vincent has two different approaches here in his two paintings at the top. The top left, it looks like he's left some of the white paper showing through, and he's left quite hard edges. So where the blue paint stops, it's quite a hard edge. I don't like this style. It's not my sort of thing. I don't think it works that well. But again, that's just a subjective opinion. It is one way of trying to represent white clouds in a blue sky in watercolor. I think the top right, he's gone for a different approach, and I think he's maybe used a bit of gouache in there to paint in the white clouds rather than leaving just white paper showing through. I'm not sure if I'm right in this, but it looks like that's maybe what he's done. It is one way of doing it, and there's quite a few watercolor artists use gouache, white gouache for clouds and highlights and things like that. The thing is, gouache, it's also a water-based paint, but it's quite different from watercolor, where watercolor is quite often sometimes transparent or quite transparent. The gouache is not, it's quite opaque usually. So watercolorists tend to use the white of the paper and let that show through. Gouache artists will use just white paint. The same as somebody who's painting in oil or acrylic would. Bottom left, I've included one of mine. Just for contrast, I have a different approach. Again, I use the white paper, but I also paint wet in wet. So I have softer, sort of indistinct edges rather than the hard edges of Vincent's top left painting. It's something that I prefer. I don't really like the hard edges, especially in the sky, but it is all just subjective opinion. But the point I wanted to make with this was there are different ways that you can approach painting skies in watercolor landscapes. You just have to experiment and find out what works for you best, what approach you like the best. These two, so the one on the left, I wanted to include this to show that Vincent did sometimes struggle with watercolor. And you can see that in the blue areas, there's lots of these sometimes called blooms or cauliflower effects, different people, different names. But it's something that you see with people who are not that familiar with watercolor and are not that confident in or experienced in using watercolor. You get these effects sometimes, and I think in this case, Vincent didn't try to put those in. He didn't mean them to appear. They don't really go with the rest of the style of the painting. So they tend to stand out as something that doesn't look great in the painting. My advice would be, if you're using watercolor, make sure it's a watercolor paper that you're trying to paint onto. That doesn't guarantee that you won't get these effects appearing, but it does make the whole process of painting with watercolor just slightly easier. Watercolor paint can be quite tricky to work with, so don't make it even more difficult for yourself. Use an actual watercolor paper that's been sized, and it's a bit easier to move the wet paint and the water around on the paper. Once you have pigment on the paper, be careful of putting any wet brushes or trying to put down other layers of paint on top of that until everything is dry. And even if it is dry, once you put wet brush onto the dry watercolor paper, watercolor pigment, it becomes reactivated and you can get effects appearing that you didn't want to appear. It's experience. It's just, you make a lot of mistakes. At least this is the way I've learned. And you slowly learn from making those mistakes. The image on the right is, I want to include this because it's an interesting idea. This is again a sort of mixed media. He's used watercolor and maybe some gouache in the background, and then the tree apparently is painted on or drawn on with charcoal. So I guess allowing the watercolor paint to dry completely and then just drawing on top of it with charcoal or pencil or whatever you want to use. It's an interesting idea. It's not something that I've really done very much of, but I might explore it in the future. So again, looking at art from artists from the past can sometimes inspire us to do certain things or try out certain things. Okay, the last two, there's just one last point I wanted to make. So the painting on the right, we've already seen this, but this time I wanted to look at the little blue cart, little horse-drawn cart that Vincent has put into this painting, into this landscape, and particularly the positioning of that little blue cart. It's pretty much in the center of the painting. The one on the left is sort of isolated farmhouse. This, I can't remember the exact title, but it's somewhere in the Netherlands. So a very flat landscape, very isolated little house. Again, the house is kind of pretty much in the center of the painting. Now, if you go online, you look on YouTube, blog posts, etc., especially those that are concerned with composition, the one thing that you'll see recurring time and time again is you should not put things in the middle of your painting. That is wrong, that is bad. Well, that's nonsense, because Vincent's done exactly that. And I think both those paintings work in their own way. I particularly like the one on the left. It's more sort of aesthetic that I like. But I think both paintings work, and in both cases he has somewhat of a focal point in the center of the painting, or very close to the center. So you get all this nonsense like the rule of thirds, which is not a rule, it's an invented rule. Somebody come up with it. It's an easy thing for people on YouTube to talk about. It's easy to explain, so it's an easy video to make. But it's complete nonsense, in my opinion. It's worthless. It sort of does trigger me a bit. People in art have this habit of making up rules. They're not really rules, they're just ideas. It's all very subjective. The thing that I love about art is there are no rules. You can do whatever you want. It's one of the few things in life where you have complete freedom to do pretty much whatever you want, in whatever way you want. Whether other people like it or hate it or whatever, you're pretty much free to do anything you want in visual art. Or at least anything that you can imagine. So why restrict yourself with these imaginary rules or these ideas? If you want to put your focal point in the middle of your painting, you go ahead and do that. That's your painting. You do whatever you want to do. And don't listen to these, let's call them experts on YouTube or whatever, who are telling you you're not allowed to do that. You do whatever you want. So that would be the final message that I would want to put in this video. If you made it this far, thank you for watching, listening, and hopefully see you again in next week's video.